Mr Chairman, I'd like to take a call in respect of vote economic development
Point of order, Joe Gucci.
Could I just seek clarification from you whether each speaker is able to take 2 speeches in each one of the votes or just 2 in the debate?
Yeah, it's 2 per vote.
Thank you, Mr Chair.
Point of order.
I just want to make the point that each time we seek clarification, Labor's actually losing speaking time, and I wonder if the junior whip could clarify things with her Leader of the House.
Well, she's doing a great job.
Order. You can't.
Not at all. We're losing speaking time.
Order. Now the Minister knows he can't interject from here, so we'll leave at that point. Anyone is entitled to bring up a point of order. I hear what the member is saying, but anyone is entitled to bring up a point of order for clarification, and I've ruled in this matter. The Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The government was elected on the promise that they would close the wage gap with Australia. Close the wage gap with Australia. By 2025 was their promise, and we've actually been trying to get a bit of promise or some clarity as to some intermediate target, because of course by 2025 not many of us, if any, that are currently in the House will be here. The current national-led government will be long gone. There's never been a 15-year government for as long as I've been alive, and I don't think this government will be a 15-year government. So there's nothing there in a 2025 target that enables the opposition or indeed members of the public to hold the government to account. So we want some intermediate targets. Now, we haven't had any. In fact, we've had the acknowledgement from the Minister that they didn't have any intermediate targets, and that's plain from the record that there aren't any.
Never see that.
I want to reflect a little bit more on the difference with Australia. At the moment, the Nobel laureate in economics, Joseph Stiglitz, is on a tour of Australia, and it's been reported that he has been complimentary of the Australian response to the recession. And I can understand why. Because Australia's done so much better in the recession than the national-led government has done in New Zealand, and indeed the contrast between Australia and New Zealand is stark. Since the recession started, their stimulus package in Australia has been effective. Unemployment has gone down. In New Zealand, the stimulus package from the New Zealand government didn't work as effectively, and unemployment has gone up. In New Zealand, wage growth has stalled, and indeed I think wage growth to the first 3 months of this year was virtually nil, very, very low rate anyway. In contrast, wage growth in Australia is still reasonable. So the wage gap with, between New Zealand and Australia, contrary to Mr Brownlee's assertion at question time today, has actually increased, not decreased, Minister. And I'm very, very surprised that the Minister hasn't corrected that on the Hansard record as yet. You know, I could forgive the Minister if there was some measure by which you could assert it to be closing. But, you know, there are sort of 3 standard measures of that sort of earnings gap between New Zealand and Australia. The first and the most relevant is what people actually earn, their wages and salaries. And that's what most people understand you to mean when you say that you're going to close the wage gap with Australia. You actually mean that the gap will get smaller, not bigger. And, you know, maybe if you could sort of somehow separate out salaries and find out that that gap had closed, maybe you could assert that. But no, neither the wage gap or the salary gap is closed, because, of course, during the period since National has been in, wage and salary growth in New Zealand has been lower than in Australia. So on that measure, Minister, the wage gap has not closed. That seems to me to be the end of it. But you might say, well, what about per capita GDP? Per capita gross domestic product? What if you measure that? Well, actually, if you measure that, the gap's got bigger, not smaller, because gross domestic product has been increasing at a higher rate, off a higher base, in Australia than it has in New Zealand. So on this measure, the gap has also got wider. So it's 2 out of 2. Well, what about if you take per person available to work, which is a wee bit different to average wages for someone working a full-time week, because it includes people who would like to work but can't because they're unemployed. Well, on that measure too, the gap has got wider, because since National took power in New Zealand, the unemployment rate has gone up in New Zealand and down in Australia. So again, Minister, I would suggest that if you're assessing earnings per available worker, then the gap between New Zealand and Australia has grown larger. So I cannot see how the Minister today in question time, who couldn't answer the question as to what is the wage gap between New Zealand and Australia, wouldn't even give us a rough idea as to what the wage gap is between New Zealand and Australia. And I have to say I'm surprised by that, given that this was such a central plank of the campaign of the National Party at the last election, that the gap is too big and they're going to narrow it and cause, Mr. Chairman, and cause it to disappear by 2025. I'm surprised that the Minister of Economic Development did not know, even within a bull's roar, what the difference is. But I'm even more surprised that he thought the gap's getting smaller.
No, better.
No, smaller. You said at question time that the gap was reducing, Mr. Brownlee.
Silent.
Mr. Brownlee said that.
Sorry. Can I just remind the Minister and the Leader of the House that when one is sitting here, that there is no interjections, although they may be humorous, it is not the place to interject.
My sincere apologies. I was deeply provoked.
And now you're questioning me. Honourable David Parker.
It's actually not a matter of hilarity that the Minister of Economic Development doesn't know what the wage gap is between New Zealand and Australia when it was such a central plank for the government at the last election. We can be pretty clear now that the Minister of Economic Development doesn't have a credible plan for bridging the gap with Australia. Both he doesn't properly understand what that gap is, doesn't know that it's going in the wrong direction rather than the right direction, and the central plank of his economic development platform, which was a step change in mining in New Zealand, this was going to cause a step change in New Zealand's economic fortunes, it's disappeared, it's evaporated. He was overruled by his cabinet colleagues, who in the end saw that what the opposition was saying all along was right, that it's inappropriate to mine in national parks, and so he's forced to abandon mining in national parks and other Schedule 4, and there's nothing to replace that. You know, there is some good work being done in respect of mineral exploration in other parts of New Zealand. That work was going on anyway. There's been no step change in that. The Minister might get to his feet and say, they're spending about $25 million on data acquisition in respect of gas and oil exploration. Well, that's true. What did the last government spend on that? I think it was $22 million over a period of 4 or 5 years from memory, so it was a very similar amount. So there's no step change coming from that. The reality is that Australia continues to march on ahead of New Zealand, and the national government is not taking any meaningful step towards it. Indeed, it's going in the wrong direction in respect of savings. Savings and investment is the big difference between the New Zealand and Australian economies, far more significant than the difference in mining, and the government has no plan to increase New Zealand's savings, to increase the depth of our capital markets so as to catch up with Australia's capital markets in a way that would enable us to have improvements in productivity such as they have had in Australia in recent years, because of course they've got better savings, more money to invest in their productive enterprises, and therefore they are marching ahead of us at a time when the National Party has been caught in the headlights. You know, Joseph Stiglitz says that Australia has a good plan to get out of recession or to avoid recession, but we have none.
Speaker.
The Honourable Jerry.